Our workshop tonight is Season Extension, Opportunities and Challenges. And this workshop was put together at the request of a number of farmers here in Southwest Missouri and also the staff at Springfield Community Gardens, because there is interest in growing beyond our traditional late spring, summer, and early fall gardening season here in Southwest Missouri. And in fact, there's huge opportunities to take advantage of production during the colder part of the year. And so tonight we're going to be talking about that. We'll learn some techniques that lead to success with season extension. We'll also learn about some of the challenges that we need to address if we're going to be successful at it. And as I mentioned, please feel free to unmute your mic if you have questions. If you want to put questions or type questions in the chat, that would be great as well. I'm Patrick Byers. I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Webster County. And as far as my assigned counties, all of the counties here in Southwest Missouri are counties that I work in. And if there's ever a situation where you want to reach out to me individually to talk about season extension, or quite frankly, anything related to growing fruits and vegetables, please feel free to do that. My email is here on the first slide. And a little bit later on towards the end, you'll also see my telephone number. So again, please reach out if there's any way that I can be of service. And I want to acknowledge my partnership in this workshop with Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens is a grassroots organization in the Springfield Greene County area that has a vision of a community where everyone has access to healthy local foods. Springfield Community Gardens has been a community leader in organizing and promoting local agriculture. They have a very effective network of community gardens across Greene County, and they also have a very interesting, innovative farmer development program. And so if anyone is interested in looking or considering commercial scale production of fruits or vegetables, reach out to Springfield Community Gardens, and I'm sure that they would love to have you become part of their network of beginning farmers. And I'll also mention that tonight's workshop is sponsored by USDA. Springfield Community Gardens has been awarded several grants, and one of the goals of these grants is to help educate people in sustainable and profitable specialty crop production, growing fruits and vegetables. And the workshop tonight is one of those workshops. The Farm Services Agency is the entry point to local USDA programs. And once you have a chance to visit the Farm Services Agency, one of the first offices you'll want to visit is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. NRCS has a number of programs to provide financial assistance to those considering specialty crop production. For example, the very innovative High Tunnel Cost Share Program is an NRCS program. And that program has been very helpful in helping farmers take advantage of the possibilities of growing in high tunnels. So please reach out to the NRCS for more information on that. The Risk Management Agency is another branch of the USDA that helps provide loans and other programs to offset the risk associated with specialty crop production. And then all of these programs are described in detail at the farmers.gov website. So for more information on the USDA, visit your local Farm Services Agency. There's one of these agency offices in every county in Missouri. So for our workshop tonight, these are the topics that we're going to talk about. First of all, protective structures. And protective structures are really essential from the standpoint of season extension. They're certainly essential from the standpoint of winter production, but even taking a warm season crop and starting it earlier in the spring or carrying it later in the fall will be much more successful through the use of protective structures. We have actually an entire workshop on protective structures that's been recorded and is available for viewing through Springfield Community Gardens. But tonight we'll also touch on some of the advantages of using protective structures. Then we'll talk about why a farmer might consider growing crops for off-season or winter production. Why would you think about extending the season? And then we'll talk about some general considerations. We'll talk about locating tunnels for most effective and efficient season extension. We'll talk about choosing crops that are particularly well suited for this. We'll talk about planting schedules, because it all comes down to good scheduling from the standpoint of success with season extension. We'll talk about managing crops during the cold part of the year, and we'll talk about marketing these crops that we've put so much time and energy into growing during the less favorable times of the year. And then we'll do a quick case study on the 2013-2014 season. And for those who've been in production for that long of a period of time, that they remember back to the earlier years of the new century, 2013-2014 was a very challenging year from the standpoint of fall, winter, and early spring production. It was, quite frankly, a rough year. And we meaning farmers and extension specialists, learned a lot during that particular winter, that fall, winter, and spring, as far as what it takes to successfully extend the season. So let's start the discussion with why high tunnels. And the reason that we consider high tunnels, and in fact the reason why we consider any sort of protected culture, is that it allows us to modify the environment. It gives us certainly protection from extreme events such as hail, high winds, rain, and snow, but it also allows us to modify temperature on an ongoing basis. That's also a useful aspect of pest management. It's key to extending the season. In general, this protection is inexpensive, especially if we take advantage of programs such as the NRCS High Tunnel Cost Share Program. It's an environment that's easy to work in, and we can use production systems similar to field conditions in many cases. So if we have experience in growing crops in the field, we can bring that experience into a high tunnel and in fact do an even better job of growing these crops. Now, there are many different variations on the high tunnel theme. And in fact, there's no perfect tunnel for all situations, but it is possible to take a tunnel design, a tunnel setup, and fit it for a given application. We can have small high tunnels. In fact, some high tunnels are small enough that they work in home gardens. Or we can have extremely large high tunnels. There are high tunnels in excess of 200 feet long and 30 feet wide here in Missouri. We have high tunnels that are movable. You can see in that upper right picture, that is a high tunnel that is on a rail that can be moved from one place to another on the farm. We also have high tunnels that might be single, individual, freestanding high tunnels, and then we have high tunnels that are joined together at the gutter so that we can have a series of high tunnels that are connected. Here's another example. This style high tunnel is called a Gothic high tunnel with a peak and then sides that drop down to sidewalls. And this is not a workshop on high tunnels, but it is important to look at some of the different types of high tunnels and figure out which one is going to work best in a given setting. This picture again shows a Gothic style high tunnel with drop down sidewalls. The high tunnel is vented through the sidewalls and through vents that will be placed in the end walls. Frequently, there is also internal movement of air encouraged by the use of fans. Movable high tunnels are definitely becoming more and more common on farms in Missouri. This is an interesting picture here. It shows 4 high tunnels, all of which are movable. And if you look closely, you notice that each high tunnel has 3 different positions in which it can be placed to move from one area to another. This can be an extremely effective way to extend the season. And in fact, you can grow a crop in the open areas and then move the tunnel over those open areas when the crop has grown to size to protect it from fall or early spring conditions. Now, if a tunnel is going to be used for season extension, if that is the goal of that particular tunnel, it is a good idea to modify that tunnel to make it more suitable for that situation. And the first thing to look at is supplemental heating sources. Now, a high tunnel by definition does not have a permanently installed heat source. Typically, the heat gain in a high tunnel is from solar energy. But there are situations, particularly early in the spring and late in the fall, where it may be important to warm the air within the high tunnel to help a crop endure cold conditions. So it's a good idea to think about supplemental heating sources. The lower picture there is a propane-fired heater. This is an example of a temporary heating source. There can be other types of heating sources that are wood-fired or natural gas-fired. There are various ways to distribute heat through a high tunnel, but it is important to think about supplemental heating sources. Another thing that will add greatly to the utility of a high tunnel for season extension is to put a double layer of plastic on the top of the high tunnel. The upper picture shows just that situation, and then inflate the area between that double layer. And here we see a small squirrel cage fan that is mounted to the framework of the tunnel, and it blows air into the area between the layers of plastic. And you'll notice that The squirrel cage fan is actually vented to the outside so that we're drawing cold air into that space between the layers. This is important because if you draw warm air from the inside, you'll get condensation between the layers, which cuts down on light penetration, especially during the dark time of the winter. Another modification that can be very helpful is to bury insulation along the sides of the high tunnel, and then to make sure that there is no air movement between the edges of the high tunnel and the soil. And then a final modification that can be made is to use insulated end walls on the tunnel. Other protective structures can be helpful in season extension as well. And in this picture, we see 3 such structures. Starting in the back, we see what's called a caterpillar tunnel. Caterpillar tunnels are not expected to endure winter conditions. They're not strong enough to support a load of ice or snow, but they can be very helpful for crops that are grown in the spring or in the fall, where the goal is to extend the season by several weeks or even more than a month until the weather turns particularly inclement during the winter. In front of the caterpillar tunnel are low tunnels, and low tunnels are widely used to extend the season. And a low tunnel is typically a structure of bent conduit or wire, and then a row cover is placed over the low tunnel. And if you look at that, you can see the row cover, and it's being anchored with sandbags along the edges. And then closest to us in this picture is a row cover that is placed directly on the crop. This is typically a short-term solution to season extension, but it can be very helpful to get crops through those first frosts in the fall or late frosts in the spring. And again, the row cover is spread on top of the crops, and a sandbag or some other type of a weight is placed on the edges to hold it in place. I'll mention passive solar greenhouses, particularly on a small scale. There may be an application for this, and for more information on passive solar greenhouses, there is a website available through Bradford Research Farm, which is part of the University of Missouri Research Farm system, where they have developed design plans for passive solar greenhouses. And then I thought we would watch a video where we actually have a farmer describing the reasons why he is using protective culture. So give me just a moment. We'll switch over to the video, and we'll take a quick look at that. I'll mention at this point again, if there are any questions, please type them into the chat. And again, we're a fairly small group. If you would like to just unmute your mics and ask questions, that would be great as well. So give me just a moment. We'll bring up the video. Okay, here is the video, and if there are any problems with the video, if you don't mind to type me a quick note in the chat. I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and it's my pleasure today to be interviewing my friend Curtis Millsap. Curtis is a farmer north of Springfield at Millsap Farm, and I've invited him to join us to talk about the reasons that he is excited and interested in growing crops under protection. I've been out to your farm many times, and it's been very interesting to see the different types of protective covers that you use. And would you go ahead and just sort of compare and contrast the different types of structures and coverings that you use?
Yeah, so, starting from a very base level, you can see in the foreground of this background picture here we've got that we used a lot of row covers. And sometimes we put those row covers on hoops. Sometimes we put those row covers flat on top of the crops. But a basic floating row cover is, it's a permeable fabric, so the water and the air can pass through, but it gives a little bit of frost protection, gives a lot of wind protection. So that's kind of the first layer of protection on the farm, and a lot of times that's enough. In the case of something like a spinach crop or even sometimes even a kale crop, that may be enough to get it through the winter. Certainly in the spring, it's enough to get it a month of earliness out in the field for those frost-hardy crops. And then the next layer of protection for us would be some sort of simple plastic tunnel. And so we build a lot of these. We've got several, we call them kitten tunnels because they're kind of smaller than what we would call a caterpillar tunnel, but they're 15 feet wide, they're 7 feet tall. They're made out of a single piece. The hoop is made out of a single piece of 24-foot long chain link top rail, and it's a single layer of plastic. And rather than having a lot of structure to it, it's really a simple thing. It sits on stakes. It's got a single purlin down the middle, and the plastic is held on by sort of lacing back and forth with rope or old used poly drip line. And those structures are smaller than our bigger structures, and so they have less capacity to hold temperature, but they do a really fabulous job of growing head lettuce, spinach, kale, choy, all those kinds of frost-hardy crops all through the winter, and we can get about a month or even a little more jump start in the spring on some of our warm weather crops as well in those tunnels. The other thing I really like about those tunnels is they're very easy to pull up stakes and move. Literally pull the stakes up. We disassemble them, and I can with one or two helpers, I can pull one of those down, move it to a new plot, and put it back up in a day. And so that's really nice in terms of soil health, the ability to rotate, because one of the issues we run into in covered space growing is soil quality and degradation. And then the next step up for me is what people would generally call a high tunnel. And so that's a pretty typical pipe structure. It's going to be a galvanized pipe. It's much heavier duty than the kitten tunnels are. So now the tunnels I've got, the high tunnels I've got are 2 3/8 inch pipe. I've got a 30-foot span and a 34-foot span, both of them 96 feet long. And those structures are great because we never worry about them in snow. They are really durable structures. They're big enough that they hold temperature better, so we get a little better frost protection in those. And they're a big open space to work in. We don't have them set up this way, but many of my friends have them set up in a way they can drive a tractor into them. And so that's handy too. When you get a big enough space like that, now you're able to work the soil with a tractor if that's what you want to do. And then the final layer of protection on our farm. Oh, and I should differentiate. So the high tunnels don't have any supplemental heat, and up till now we have not talked about any sort of supplemental heat. The only thing I'll do in the high tunnels is in the early tomatoes, I will bring some of those propane torpedo heaters, so 1 heater per tunnel, and I'll run that just as a kind of insurance. So on a 28-degree night or something, I'll put row covers over the tomatoes, but I'll also bring a torpedo heater in there and I'll run that overnight. It'll cost me about $15 in propane to run one of those overnight, and it'll protect us from frost down to about 23 is as low as I've seen that go, and have that propane heater work. Pretty simple, easy, low-cost protection, but it's nothing permanent. And then we go into our biggest structure, and that is a greenhouse. And it's built in the concrete foundation. It actually has sidewalks, things like that. My predecessor used it to grow nursery crops. We grow primarily primarily food, but of course we also grow all of our seedlings in there as well. And it has a propane furnace and a wood furnace. It has permanent hydrants and hoses everywhere. It's a very utilitarian growing structure, but also has some of the bells and whistles that make it more comfortable to work with, and a certain level of automation. So it's got thermostats and fans, things like that. So it's kind of, as you look at the spectrum, it goes from that simple row cover laid on top of plants all the way up to this 2-layer plastic on top of serious metal structure that has electricity and furnaces and things like that. So we really have a full spectrum of options, and all of them have their place. There's certainly an increasing price spectrum. So as somebody gets started, as I got started, certainly the low-cost options were the ones that made sense. But as we've been able to upgrade, some of the nice things about like a high tunnel is it's a little bit easier to work with. It costs a little more, but it requires a little less of the grower in terms of daily work. So in some ways, what I see the differential as you work your way up the scale is the higher you get up the cost and sort of we'll say, utility scale. So, the more useful and the more it heats and takes care of the plants, the less it requires of the grower to put in grunt work each day, and vice versa. So you can kind of trade money for labor in a sense. So that's one way to think of how the tunnels work. And then the other way to think of it is, at the low end of the spectrum, you're doing minimal protection, and so you're going to expect minimal increase for that. And then when you get into an actual greenhouse where you can control nighttime temperatures to a high degree, I mean, we can keep a 50-degree nighttime temperature in our greenhouse through the winter if we want to with those wood furnaces and the propane furnace. Now we're talking about a structure that can do a tremendous amount in terms of production that those high tunnels and ground covers really can't. So there's a trade-off there. And I think everybody has to kind of find their sweet spot within that spectrum. But that's what we do.
I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I want to thank Curtis Millsap for joining me today to talk about his experiences with protected culture.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions relative to protective structures, or why you might want to be thinking about a high tunnel or another structure to help with season extension? Any questions at all? And again, feel free to unmute and ask questions, or if you want to type them in the chat, that would be fine too. Okay, well, not hearing any questions, let's go ahead and continue with the presentation. Okay, so we've seen that it is possible to extend the season, and of course the question that follows next is, why would a farmer want to consider this? Maybe it's enough just to grow crops during the warmer part of the year, but there are some pretty compelling reasons why more and more farmers are considering growing crops during the late fall, winter, and spring, and marketing those crops. And first of all, of course, it spreads out your income to all 12 months. It can sometimes be a challenge from the standpoint of cash flow to only have income during the warmer part of the year. So being able to develop an income for all 12 months can be very helpful for farmers. It's also a great way to keep a customer base. If you have to renew your customer base every year because you're not marketing crops for 3 or 4 of the months of the year, then that can become a challenge. But by looking at late fall, winter, and spring production, you can certainly keep and expand the customer base. For example, we have seasonal auctions. Yes, that's a great place to sell, but those buyers at those seasonal auctions may actually have 12-month customers. So they may be looking for sources for product for 12 months of marketing. There are many buyers who would like to continue supplying locally grown produce throughout the growing season. There are other marketing options that might be available for off-season marketing. Now, of course, it's a little bit like the hen and the egg situation. We need farmers who are interested in growing 12 months out of the year to develop these markets that are interested in 12-month production. But we are seeing a steady growth in demand, and to correspond with that, a steady growth in the number of farmers who are growing crops for marketing during the late fall, winter, and spring. Again, we talked about income in 12 months, but it certainly spreads out income and can actually lead to less stress during the traditionally stressful time of midsummer on the farm. So that can be a help as well. There is market demand for production in the late fall, winter, and early spring. Again, the market demand is for locally grown year-round. It's not just a 9-season situation. And again, there's opportunity for farmers who are willing to address the realities of growing for these markets and meeting the demands of these markets. Okay, so hopefully that those past statements have helped you perhaps think about growing during the colder times of the year in the late fall, winter, and early spring. Now let's take a look at some general considerations on how to succeed in growing crops at this time. And this picture, you'll see this again here in a few moments with more explanation, but this is a good picture of what winter production looks like. Okay, we're under protection here. In this case, we're in a high tunnel. We also have low tunnels within the high tunnel. We have crops that were planted during the late summer and fall and allowed to grow to size, and now they're being protected within these structures in a marketable condition. And so harvest can take place throughout the late fall, winter, and early spring in this setting. And this picture, again, is sort of a capsule of what it takes to be successful for season extension. Now, we're thinking about high tunnels or other protective structures. It's important to think carefully about where these are going to be located. And even if we're looking at field production with the idea of extending the season a little bit later in the fall or a little bit earlier in the spring, here's some things to think about. Sunlight is very important, particularly as we enter the darker time of the year. As we enter fall, winter, and early spring, sunlight is at a premium, and we need to take advantage of every ray of sunlight that we can here in Southwest Missouri. Very important to avoid shadows. Now, if you're doing your planning during the summer, it can be a little bit of a challenge to understand where those shadows are going to be for the winter, because the sun does move in its position. But it's important to think about winter more so than summer from the standpoint of avoiding shadows. The site should be reasonably level, have good drainage, away from trees. Yes, again, because trees too cast shadows, but a windbreak is actually good because it can help moderate wind during the colder time of the year. And by moderating wind, you help remove the loss of heat from structures such as high tunnels. You will need water even during the colder time of the year, so water should be available nearby. And of course, the soil should be suitable for what you plan to do with it. It should be suitable for specialty crop production. Now, some more thoughts on light. Again, light is critical, especially if we're looking at starting crops early in the season or carrying them late in the season, and especially if we want to hold crops through the winter. And again, we can calculate the angle of incidence, and that's going to give us a feel for what the light is going to be like at our particular location. Now, if we look at parts of the world that have angles of incidence that are less than 50 degrees, then that's pretty much a good situation. There's going to be minimal effect on light transmittance from that standpoint. But if we get into a situation where the angle of incidence is greater than 50 degrees, then light transmittance decreases rapidly. Okay, so this is important to consider. Now, an important aspect of whether or not we're going to have enough light has to do with the orientation of the tunnel. Okay, because the tunnel itself is going to cast shadows just based upon its structure. And so it's important to think about where we're located and how we're going to orient the tunnel. And sort of the guiding point in this situation is to consider your latitude. And if you're at a situation, your farm is located above 40 degrees north, then it's important that you consider orienting the tunnel with the length going east to west. Okay, this allows for a low light angle, or allows for low angle light during the winter to enter from the side where it will not be blocked by the ribs of the frame. So this is an important thing to consider. Now, if you're located at below 40 degrees north latitude, then you want to orient the tunnel with the length running north to south. And at these lower latitudes, this is acceptable because the angle of the winter sun is much higher. You have much better penetration of the sunlight at these lower latitudes. So again, 40 degrees north is our benchmark. Now, if you're growing in gutter-connected tunnels, it's important to think about orientation in these settings too. And if you're growing in gutter-connected tunnels at all latitudes, these should be oriented north to south. Again, this avoids the shadow that occurs from the tunnel next to, or the tunnel that is just to the south of another tunnel if you orient the tunnels in an east to west layout. So in other words, by orienting them north to south, you avoid that shadow from the neighboring tunnel. Now, where are we here in Missouri? Well, you can see Missouri is actually located at about 38 to 39 degrees north latitude. Okay, so again, depending on where you are here in the state. And we're actually in kind of an interesting sweet spot. And because of our location, we can actually orient tunnels north, south, or east, west, and see a minimization of problems related to sunlight penetration. So we're in kind of a good situation here in that we can orient our tunnels based upon site situations rather than strictly based upon sunlight penetration. Yeah, again, depending on where you are, about 37 degrees north, either direction of orientation is acceptable as regards sun exposure. So this is a great situation. Now, some other considerations is looking at crops within the tunnel. We want to set the planting design up so that we don't shade crops in adjacent beds by taller crops. So in a north-south orientation in a tunnel, we want to place our tall crops on the east side of the tunnel. Again, the majority of the light is going to penetrate the tunnel from the west side in a north-south orientation, and having tall crops on the east side will minimize shading of the crops on the west side of the tunnel. And as you might expect, if we have tunnels in an east-west orientation, the north side is going to get shaded with taller crops if we plant them on the south side. So plant the tallest crops on the north side of tunnels that are oriented east and west. Some more considerations on light. I mentioned the light was important, so we're spending a little bit of time talking about this. We talked about locating tunnels away from trees. Trees do cast shadows. Keep in mind that conifers, evergreens, will be casting shadows year-round. Deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall become less of a concern after they've lost their canopies. But even in the case of deciduous trees, we want to avoid the shadows that are cast by those trees. So ideally, trees and other structures that might be around a high tunnel should be set back at least 2.5 times their height. So if you have, say, a tree that's 40 foot tall, then that tree needs to be about 100 feet away from a tunnel to avoid any issues related to shade. Multiple single bay tunnels in an east-west orientation should be about 20 feet apart. In other words, if they're not gutter connected, but you have multiple tunnels and they're in a row oriented east to west, place those tunnels about 20 feet apart to avoid shading. As a rule of thumb, if your tunnels are in a north-south orientation, and again, they're not gutter connected, but they're individual tunnels, those tunnels can be closer together because you're going to have less issue of shading from the adjacent tunnel. So those could be as close as 4 foot apart. And keep in mind, it's always a reality that locating high tunnels north of major structures is an undesirable siting. You know, try not to locate high tunnels north of major structures. Now this is an overhead diagram of a farm site, and again, you can see the production area in the center. And this particular area, small scale, yes, but it was set up with winter production in mind. And again, the offset from the house, from the buildings, and from the trees is sufficient, but yet we're still seeing protection on the north by the shed from north winds. The house protects from winds, east winds. It's on the east side of the production area. And then we have some trees along the south side that protect from south winds. So again, a situation where we have plenty of offset, we don't have issues with shade, but we have good protection based upon the location of the production area. Okay, I think we'll pause at this point. If anyone has any questions relative to siting a high tunnel or other protective structure, this would be a good point to unmute yourself and ask the question. Any questions? Okay, well, again, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions as we move ahead, and of course, enter in the chat too, although I can't directly see the chat, so it's a little bit more of a challenge for me to know if there's a question in the chat. Okay, now let's turn our attention to what we can grow for season extension. Now, you can look at the vegetable crops that are commercially grown here in Missouri and break them into two groups based upon their tolerance of cold conditions. We have cold season crops and we have warm season crops. And if we look at this graph here, we can actually see which crops are being grown in high tunnels here in Missouri and in the Central Great Plains. This is based upon a survey at the Great Plains Growers Conference. And we can see by far the dominant crops are tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. And those three crops are all warm season crops. There is the opportunity to extend the season with these crops, but these are these are not good candidates for production during the cold time of the year. But if we look at the next group of crops and those that have a blue arrow over them, we notice salad greens, spinach, beets, brassicas, carrots, and onions. These are all crops that are suited for growing during the fall, winter, and early spring in-season extension settings. So again, these are all excellent candidates to consider for production in high tunnels if your goal is to extend the season. We'll talk a little bit about tomatoes here a bit later on if your interest is in starting a tomato crop early. But from the standpoint of fall, winter, and early spring production, extending the season into the cold time of the year, the crops with the arrows are the ones that are a primary consideration. And again, just to highlight those crops, they tend to be root crops such as radishes, turnips, rutabagas, and carrots, leafy crops such as lettuce, spinach, or chard, cole crops, and in some cases we can actually grow peas as well in season extension settings. And again, just to show you some lovely pictures of crops that have been harvested during the late fall, winter, and early spring out of high tunnels. Here's radishes, turnips, and rutabagas. The root crops such as parsnips, beets, and carrots. Lettuces of many types, both leaf lettuces and head lettuce, and specialty greens. And on the subject of specialty greens, there are a group of greens that are very hardy and are well suited for production in season extension settings. And these include arugula, chicories of various types, claytonia, escarole, dandelions, and endive. Kale is an excellent crop to consider for a late fall, winter, and spring production. Mache, Mitsuma, tatsoi, these various types of mustards grow quite well, and then sorrel and radicchio. Spinach and chard are well suited for season extension. And then I mentioned the kales, and again, just to show you some of the variety that's available in kales, we have lacinato in the upper right there, we have Russian kale in the center, curly kale, lower right, and a Siberian kale. All of these would be excellent candidates from the standpoint of season extension and winter production. And again, just to highlight some of the other crops, arugula, various types of alliums, including bunching onions and leeks, Chinese cabbage, cole crops such as broccoli and Brussels sprouts, pak choi, and then we have several herbs, primarily the cilantro and dill. There are occasionally others that can be grown for a late fall, winter, and spring production. And again, just to highlight lettuce, spinach, and greens. These are excellent choices and are widely grown as season extension crops here in Missouri. High profit potential on these crops. They can be sold in a variety of ways as cut mixes. They can be sold as individual heads, or leaf lettuces can be gathered and sold as bunches. Row covers, very important from the standpoint of maintaining quality during the winter. They can fit nicely into a cycle of crops where you might have, for example, a spring and early summer tomato crop, a cucumber crop that follows that early tomato crop, and then follow the cucumber crop with lettuce, spinach, and greens. Keep in mind that these need to be in place and grown to size by November. And on the subject of planting times, planting schedules are critically important. This is probably the most important aspect of success in season extension. Certainly we can talk about growing structures and we can talk about locating these structures in the right place, but if we don't do a good job of scheduling the plantings, we're not going to be able to grow crops to size, hold them in good condition for marketing, and then be ready to go from the standpoint of meeting the market demands during the off-season. Planning is critical. There's lots of variables to consider. First of all, of course, the goal is to grow the crop to size when conditions are favorable for growth. So this means planting during the warmer time of the season, or it means planting and providing good conditions for growth of these crops. So for example, if we want to grow a crop that is going to be marketed in the late fall and winter, this crop needs to be grown to size during the late summer and early fall when conditions are favorable for growing. And then once we've grown this crop, whatever that crop might be, then we use protective structures, especially row covers, to hold that crop in a marketable condition so that we can harvest it and sell it when growing conditions are not particularly favorable. Crops really don't grow much during the winter. So that period of time from November through early March is a period of time where crops don't grow, but by using protective structures, especially row covers, we can hold crops that have already grown by this time in a marketable condition. So again, we have to understand our growing parameters. We need to have an idea of what we're going to need to market on a given date. So for example, if our goal is to meet the needs of a winter farmer's market, we have to have some idea of how much crop we're going to need for each of those winter markets, and we have to plan accordingly. How much space is that crop going to take up? How long is it going to be from seeding or transplanting? In many cases, as we'll see here in a moment, it's more effective to grow transplants and move these into a high tunnel or under low covers to grow them to size rather than direct seeding. And is the crop for a one-time harvest, or can we grow it for several harvests? For example, if we're growing spinach for a late fall, winter, and spring production, some of that spinach may be sold as full-size plants. In that case, we may be harvesting individual leaves off of a larger size spinach plant. So we have to plant that plant earlier to grow it to size before the winter comes. In other cases, we may be growing spinach as a baby spinach where we harvest the entire plant. In that case, we're going to plant a denser planting, and we're going to plant a little bit later so that we have smaller plants at the time that we plan to harvest it. Here are some benchmark dates to consider based upon the crop that you want to grow. So let's say, for example, your goal is to grow kale for a winter harvest. Well, we're going to be planting that kale in early July so that we can grow it to size and we have adequate leaves for harvest during the cold part of the year. We're also going to plant several succession plantings. The early July planting, those plants will grow to size quickly. They'll be large enough to be harvesting in October, November, and December. But we're going to need kale in December, January, and February. So we'll need to plant some later plantings of kale that will again grow to size, and then we can hold those plantings in reserve until we need to begin harvesting off of those. So again, scheduling is very important, considering when we need a crop from the standpoint of our market, and then also considering the space that we have available in which to grow these crops. A mature kale plant takes up a lot of space. So we would need to be thinking about the space that we have available. This is a picture that I actually took today on September 24th. This is a picture of a high tunnel that is in transition. And so this high tunnel was used to grow a mid-season crop of tomatoes. And we can see those tomatoes over on the right-hand side of this picture. The farmer was planning to remove these tomatoes within a week. If we look at the far left-hand side of this picture, we can see kale. This kale was planted back in July. It's grown to size, and in fact, the farmer's been harvesting from this kale already. But there'll be enough leaves present on this planting of kale to carry harvest likely into November, early December. In the very center, the farmer has just planted spinach. And again, this is somewhat late for a planting. This spinach is going to be for baby spinach. So the farmer, you can see that the rows are fairly close together. The soil temperature is being monitored to make sure it's suitable for direct seeded spinach. And then the spinach will grow. It will be of adequate size for harvest as baby spinach then during the winter. So again, this farmer has a good handle on scheduling. And this farmer also has a good handle. She's done a really nice job of looking at using the space inside of this tunnel very efficiently. Granted, the tomatoes are there. Tomatoes are a high value crop, but they take up a lot of space. And now it's time to be removing that crop, even though there may still be tomatoes on it, green tomatoes on it, and clearing that space out so that she can get her tunnel in order for production and marketing through the late fall, winter, and early spring. Another example, looking at spinach succession. So this farmer had a goal of marketing spinach from November through January, marketing both baby spinach and full-size leaves. So the first planting was planted the 1st of September. This was actually planted in the field. And this planting is going to be harvested as small plants. There's not going to be enough time to grow a large plant in the field by planting this late, but there is plenty of time to grow baby spinach. The farmer will keep on hand row covers in case we get inclement weather in October, but this crop will be harvested then by mid-November for sales during November. The second planting on the 1st of September is inside the high tunnel or the hoop house. Planting at this point in the protected environment of the hoop house We'll give that spinach plenty of time to grow to full size before the weather turns too cold. And then the farmer will hold the spinach in good condition with row covers on low tunnel row covers within the hoop house for harvest through February. And this is full size. Individual leaves are going to be harvested off of this spinach. Farmer also wanted a harvest of baby spinach after the November planting. So a planting was planted in mid-September, and this was in a hay grove or a three-season tunnel. The spinach will grow and do beautifully in that. It will reach baby spinach size by the time the weather turns cold, and then the farmer will harvest this crop and then remove the cover from the hay grove before winter conditions become so severe that there might be damage to the hay grove tunnel. The fourth planting is done in early October. This too is done in the high tunnel, and the goal here again is to grow baby spinach. There's enough time in the protected environment to grow baby spinach from a later planting in October, and this crop will be harvested in December and January. And then in a high tunnel there is another planting. This is transplants, where again seedlings are started in a protected environment and then they're grown up and then they're transplanted into the high tunnel in early November. And this is the emergency spinach. This is the spinach that's grown to full size. It's backup in case there's not enough spinach to meet the market demands from the other plantings. So again, this farmer has done a nice job of figuring out the schedule that's going to work to have both baby spinach and full-size spinach available from November through January. And again, just to highlight the protective structures that can be used to accomplish the goals of a late fall, winter, and early spring production strategy. Row covers in the upper left-hand side, low tunnels in the upper right-hand side. The lower right-hand side are low tunnels within a high tunnel, and then, of course, a classic high tunnel in the lower left. Now, when it comes to scheduling, we need to be thinking about transplants versus direct seeding. And in general, most of the planting that is done for season extension is going to be transplanting. Transplanting is great because you can take out a crop and then very quickly put plants back into the space that is made available by removing that crop. And if you think back to the picture we saw of the high tunnel in transition, those tomato plants, as soon as those tomato plants are removed and that bed space is prepped, that farmer is going to go back in and transplant lettuce into that space. You know, she started that lettuce 4 weeks ago. It's grown to size, and she'll transplant those soil blocks with the lettuce into that space and very quickly fill that space with larger plants. This is definitely preferable to direct seeding into that space. And in fact, as I said, most successions and rotations for season extension are established with transplanted plants. Now, there are some plants such as carrots or arugula, perhaps some of the hardy winter greens that are direct seeded, and that's fine. But particularly when looking at things such as lettuces, late planted spinach, and some of the other season extension crops, it's much more efficient, much more effective to work with transplants. Now, what that means, of course, is that you have to have a supply of plants that have been grown to size as transplants ready to plug in to the space that opens up during rotations, which typically means you need a dedicated growing space for transplants. And again, just back to some key planting dates, depending upon the type of crop that you're growing and the time in which you plan to harvest it. Okay, are there any questions regarding scheduling of plantings for season extension? Any questions at all? And again, please feel free to unmute your mics and ask any questions. Okay, I'm going to take just a pause here to stop share and take a quick look at the chat. Okay, we do have a question in the chat. And the question, is it better to have permanent siding or non-permanent? And I suspect, Aaron, that you're talking about high tunnels. And if that's the case, typically high tunnels are developed with, well, I'll back up. There's not a really typical setting. In many cases, they're developed with a plastic poly-covered end wall or siding. And then the curtains are also a plastic material that will be replaced at some point. But more and more tunnels that are intended for winter production are going in with insulated end walls that are built out of rigid plastic materials that are more permanent in nature. So in that case, yes, there could be a permanent aspect to the end walls of tunnels that are intended for winter production. Does anyone have any additional questions at this point that you'd like to ask? And again, please feel free to unmute your mics if you'd like to do that. Okay. Hopefully at this point everyone has a mic. Any questions? Erin, do you have a question?
Can you hear me now?
I can
Oh,
indeed.
gosh.
Yes, I can indeed.
Okay, so maybe a goofy question. Are fruit trees ever done inside high tunnels, or do they not have the height for something like that?
Fruit trees can certainly be done in high tunnels. And in fact, sweet cherries are more and more widely grown in high tunnels because the high tunnels protect the trees when they're in fruit. Now, you're correct. Many fruit trees are tall enough stature that they're difficult to put into a high tunnel. And if a person is considering fruit tree production in high tunnels, it's generally best to purchase trees that are grafted onto size controlling rootstocks. In other words, to try to find the smallest tree possible. And with sweet cherries, we can do that. We can also do that with crops such as apples and tart cherries. We're seeing lots of berries grown in high tunnels. And in fact, raspberries are widely used for production in high tunnels, or high tunnels are widely used for raspberry production. But strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, figs are more and more being grown in high tunnels. So again, lots of opportunities for growing fruits in high tunnels.
So one more question with that. Would you be better off with a tunnel that you could move so that they have the exposure in the summer and then just protect it in the spring and fall, or would it be more of a permanent setup for tunnels with fruits like that?
So that's actually an excellent point to bring up, because when we think about growing in a high tunnel, we want to maximize the income potential from that high tunnel. And yes, fruits are valuable, but typically, let's say if we use raspberries as an example, we're only picking raspberries maybe for 4 to 6 weeks. And then the rest of the time, if it's a permanent tunnel and a permanent planting of raspberries, we're not using that tunnel space as we could. So what we can do in that setting is exactly what you described, and that's use a movable tunnel where we just move the tunnel over the raspberries when we need it, and then we can move it off into another production area where we may be growing, say, a crop of winter lettuce or winter spinach, which will give us additional income potential from that same structure. So yes, it is helpful to have a movable tunnel if you're growing a perennial crop like a fruit crop.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? And again, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you might have. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to the presentation then. And again, please, questions, type them into the chat or ask them as they occur to you. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk a bit more about some particular aspects of managing crops during the late fall, winter, and spring when we're thinking about season extension. And we'll talk a bit about row covers, and then we'll talk about some pest management aspects with insects, diseases, and weeds. So row covers, I've mentioned row covers numerous times already tonight, and they are an extremely useful tool for farmers who are considering season extension. And basically, when we talk about row covers, these are lightweight, spun-bonded polypropylene blankets. You can think of them as blankets, but it's a spun-bonded fabric-type material. You typically purchase it on rolls that are given widths, and there's lots of different widths, all the way from perhaps something as narrow as 4 feet to widths of 14 feet or even wider. And in many cases, these row covers, these blankets, if you want to call it that, are placed directly on plants, or in other cases, they're supported on hoops or other structures over the crop. Okay, and we've already seen some pictures showing the differences between blankets on beds or blankets on hoops. Row covers are permeable to light, water, and air. Now, granted, when you put a row cover over a crop, you are cutting down significantly on the transmittance of light to that crop. But there is still some light that does penetrate row covers, especially lighter weight row covers. And they're very effective at letting water and air pass through them. They can be helpful in retaining the warmth of solar gain in soil. And typically, though, we can't have too high of an expectation. We get about a 2 to 8 degree increase in temperature under the cover. You know, sometimes you hear people say, well, you know, I can grow a crop through the deepest, darkest, coldest days of winter by just putting a layer of row cover on it. And typically that's not entirely true. You know, we have to look at all aspects of winter production to be successful. Now, row covers come in different weights, different thicknesses, and it's important to source the appropriate row cover for the use that you intend it to be. And typically for a midwinter management, we're looking at heavier weight row covers. They can be, say 0.9 or even heavier ounces per square yard. Row covers that are used during other times of the year, and oftentimes row covers that are used for purposes such as insect management or lighter weight. Okay. Now we can use more than one layer of row cover and see even more benefit. And, you know, for example, with a single layer of row cover, we might get about a 5 degree increase in temperature. With 2 layers of row cover, we may be able to increase that to 8 to 10 degrees increase. And with hardy crops in cold seasons, that can make all the difference. And row covers are not placed on crops and left in place indefinitely during the colder part of the year. They're placed on the crop and then removed in response to temperature. And in fact, when I talk with farmers about management of crops during season extension periods, you know, in the fall, the winter, and the spring, they always come back to, well, it's all about row cover management, which means that they're covering and uncovering crops in response to environmental conditions. And that's particularly true in a climate like Missouri's, where it's not unusual to have warm periods even during December, January, and February. And during warm periods, row covers are removed. And then those row covers are replaced when the temperatures become cold again. So again, an important part of management is being able to work with your row covers. And this is interesting. This is some data from January of 2003 looking at the heat gain that was seen using row covers. And so, for example, here we have a situation where we have 3 lines on this particular graph. The green line is the outside temperature. And you can see it got pretty cold in that period of time. In fact, it was down close to 0 a number of times. And then if we look at the environment within a high tunnel, but without row covers, that's the blue line. And you can see it was significantly warmer just within the tunnel. But look at the added benefit we saw by using row covers inside of the high tunnel. And this was a double layer of row covers. It was lightweight row cover over lettuce. And we saw an improvement of 20 degrees growing the lettuce under the double layer of row cover within the high tunnel. So again, by combining a high tunnel and then additional coverings within the high tunnel, we can see a benefit. And again, this was sufficient to bring the lettuce through in good condition. We had excellent results from this particular management strategy in 2003. Here is a friend of mine, a farmer, who has really jumped onto the row cover train with both feet. And you can see he's growing within a high tunnel. And then he has hoops over each bed. There are 4 beds within this tunnel. There are 2 layers of row cover directly on the crop, and then there's 2 layers of row cover on hoops over the crop. So in essence, he has 5 layers of protection over these crops. The layer in the high tunnel, 2 layers on the low tunnel over the hoops, and then 2 layers directly on the crop. And let's see if he was successful. Here's that same tunnel again on a warm day in January where he's uncovered the crops, and you can see that, yes, these crops are doing beautifully in this particular setting, again, under the high tunnel. The other thing to notice is he's venting the sides of the high tunnel. Notice that the curtains down the length of the high tunnel had been lowered to allow air to move in. So even in January, which normally is cold, we can see that we've had a situation where it's warmed up enough in the high tunnel to remove the row covers and to vent the high tunnel to remove the warm, humid air. Erin, I believe you had your hand up if you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
So do you have issues with the, like along the edges with it? I would assume it's colder along the edges of your tunnel. You'd put things that are hardier on the edge and the things that are temperature. Okay.
Yes,
and
that is certainly the case. And we'll actually discuss that here in a bit. But some of the strategies to address that, again, first of all, plant your hardiest crops along the outer edges. And then another strategy is to actually bury insulation along the edges of the high tunnel. So kind of keep those two ideas in mind as we go through the coming slides. And I think you'll see some examples of how that is done.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Any other questions? Again, please feel free to unmute and ask any questions you might have. Now here's another situation, again, during the winter. And in fact, you can actually see some snow up on the top of this high tunnel. And in this case, the farmer is not covering individual beds. The farmer is using a frost blanket or a row cover over the entire production area. And the farmer has stretched wires across the beds and then is laying row covers that cover that entire area. And you can see that here's the process. And again, when you think about row cover management, you're going to be placing the covers and removing the covers in response to environmental conditions. So you want to set this up so that it's efficient to move those covers onto and off of cropping areas. And that's exactly what this farmer is doing. And here, again, the wires are actually attached to the end walls. And here you can see an end wall. And notice the material that this end wall is constructed out of. This is rigid plastic. It's a material that has channels within 2 layers of rigid plastic. So it's a very good insulated layer. This tunnel is intended for winter production, and the farmer has designed it such that the end walls help maintain the warmth within the tunnel. And again, here you can see the edge of the tunnel. I mentioned insulation. Notice the pink insulating board that is placed along the outer wall of this particular tunnel. This board is actually buried in the ground about 12 inches. And that gives a nice layer of insulation along those cold edges that we mentioned earlier. And here's the tunnel with the frost blanket or the row cover spread over the entire production area. Now, turning our attention to pest management during the periods of time where we're extending the season, in general, we do have less insect pressure during the late fall, winter, and early spring than we do during the warmer time of the year. Again, less pressure, but that doesn't mean that there is no pressure. And particularly aphids can become a problem even during the winter period in hoop houses, high tunnels, and other production areas. We also see grasshoppers and cabbage caterpillar activity during this time of year. It's important to keep weeds under control because oftentimes these weeds are alternate host plants for these pest insects, and they can move very quickly from weeds to crop plants. Very important to scout crops regularly, and this is especially true with brassicas, looking for aphids and looking for brassica worms. But aphids in particular can reproduce under cool conditions. And so, a minor aphid problem can very quickly explode into a major issue if you let down your guard. So be sure that you're scouting regularly. Labeled pesticides can be used in high tunnels during the winter to address pest issues. Keep in mind that the labels here in Missouri, the labels for use within high tunnels are specific. And it's very interesting. We have a situation in Missouri that if the insecticide is applied when the sidewalls are down and there is outside air coming into the high tunnel, then we can use pesticides that are labeled for field use. But if the high tunnel walls are up and the entire tunnel is closed up, then we can only use pesticides that are labeled for greenhouse use. There are some situations where the best approach is to discard heavily infested plants, and I've seen farmers do this with lettuce. Aphids can get out of hand. It can be very difficult to manage them. In this case, the best approach is to discard that part of the crop that is heavily infested. And then once harvest is done, and particularly with crops like spinach or lettuce, there may still be some plant material left behind after harvest. Clean the beds up and remove this debris so that we don't leave an insect problem in place after harvest. We want to get that bed ready for a cover crop or for the next rotation. Disease management, again, as is the case with insects, there's less disease issue in high tunnels and other protective structures during the cool time of the year. But that doesn't mean there are no diseases, and we want to be thinking about disease management. And the first step, of course, is to manage the environment. And the factors that favor disease development during the season extension periods are humidity and wet, cloudy weather. And so during the wintertime, even, as we saw in that picture earlier, even during the wintertime, we're going to be venting high tunnels to let this humid air out and to keep it from becoming too warm within that environment. Where we run into problems is during wet, cloudy, cold weather, where it can be difficult to find a period of time where it's warm enough to vent the tunnel. And those are the situations where we frequently see disease issues develop. Whenever possible, we want to choose disease-resistant varieties to grow for a season extension, maintain proper spacing so that we have good air movement around plants. You may remember from that earlier picture where we saw the kale and the tomatoes together. Notice there was adequate space around those kale plants to allow for good air movement. That's critically important. We want to vent tunnels whenever possible during the cold time of the year to remove humidity. And then if necessary, we can use labeled fungicides to help manage disease issues during a season extension. And then we're not free of weed problems either during the cool time of the year. The primary weed issues during this time of the year are winter annual weeds, so weeds such as chickweed or henbit. Very important to manage these weeds. This can be done by using shallow tillage. We can flame beds before we plant. We can also use mulches, or we can use plastic covered beds. Okay, do we have any questions at this point before we, again, talk about some scenarios? Any questions? And again, please feel free to unmute yourself or to type the question into chat.
I have a quick question for you.
Yes.
How well do these high tunnels and things hold up when you have your lovely tornadoes that blow through?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. When we think about, first of all, selecting a type of high tunnel to use here in Missouri, we want to be thinking about more typical conditions. As far as planning for a tornado, you really can't. A high tunnel will not stand up to a tornado. A high tunnel will not stand up to sustained high winds. Winds of 75 to 100 miles per hour are going to take down a high tunnel. It's just the way it is. But on the other hand, more typical conditions, we want to develop, or we want to select high tunnels that are strong. We want to select high tunnels that have internal bracing. And we want to think about high tunnels that can effectively do things such as shed snow from them during the winter. And so by selecting high tunnels with beefy structures, we can get through most of what Mother Nature throws at us here in Missouri. But you're right, there are extreme weather conditions that can damage high tunnels.
Do they handle hail pretty well?
High tunnels do a pretty good job of handling hail. It depends to some extent on the size of the stones and the duration of the hailstorm. But what can frequently happen with larger stones and with hail of long duration is you end up with lots of pinpoint holes in the plastic cover. And at that point, it's probably better to replace the plastic cover.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, any other questions? Okay, let's take a look at a couple of scenarios. We'll talk about early tomato production. We'll talk about a little bit different type of season extension here with lettuce. But with early tomatoes, there's a lot of interest in growing tomatoes targeting an early crop. Farmers who can produce tomatoes that are ripe in late May and June will receive a premium price for those tomatoes. But in order to do that, it's very important to plan from the beginning that that's what you're going to do. And we talked about those modifications of high tunnels to make them suitable for season extension. those are very important considerations for early tomato production. So, those houses that are suitable for early production typically will have a double layer of plastic that's inflated. Typically, they'll have insulation buried along the edges, and typically they'll have end walls that are insulated as well. Farmers definitely want to keep on hand supplemental heat. Okay, and you can see here a picture. This is one of those torpedo heaters that Curtis mentioned in the video that we saw earlier. Now, to make this work, the seeds for seedling production are planted in mid-January. Typically, farmers will target about January 15th, and you'll grow the transplants in a heated structure. With tomatoes, it takes about 6 weeks from planting till you have a transplant of sufficient size to plant into the high tunnel. So a planting in mid-January is then ready to go into the tunnel in early March. Now, obviously, we're not past cold weather in early March. And in fact, there's probably about a month and a half of growing time where farmers have to keep a close eye on temperatures. And if the temperature does drop below about 40 degrees, then supplemental heat is warranted. Now, you might say, well, 40 degrees is well above freezing, and certainly it is, but tomato transplants will be adversely affected by cold temperature. It will stunt the plants, quite frankly. And so we have to maintain the temperature, air temperature, but also the soil temperature above 40 degrees, and preferably above 50 degrees to encourage rapid early growth of the seedlings. Now, once we get into mid-April, generally temperatures have warmed up enough outside. We have enough sunlight that just the normal solar gain of a high tunnel precludes the use of supplemental heat. But still keep those heaters handy in case we have an unseasonably late frost. And by doing that, you should be able to succeed in developing a tomato crop that will then easily be 4, sometimes 6 weeks earlier than normal. Now, a couple of thoughts on supplemental heat. If you're going to use something like a wood-burning stove or a propane-burning stove that is going to be there for longer duration, it's really important to vent those heaters to the outside air. If you release fumes within the high tunnel, tomatoes are extremely susceptible to damage from ethylene and other materials that are in fumes from heaters or from wood-fired stoves. And you want to avoid doing that whenever possible. Now, when we talk about season extension, what typically comes to mind is growing crops later in the fall through the winter and early in the spring. But with lettuce, oftentimes an issue is growing lettuce during the summer when it's warm. There's a huge demand for locally grown lettuce during the warm part of the year. And lettuce is a cool season crop. Traditionally, we could not develop good quality lettuce for marketing in July and August. But we now have systems that have been developed for summer lettuce production. And this information was shared with me by Jason Hertz of Box Turtle Farm here in Southwest Missouri. And Jason has been a very successful grower of lettuce year-round, but particularly during the summer. So some things to think about. We now have heat-tolerant cultivars of lettuce, so you obviously want to choose those types for summer production. Very important to suspend a row cover over the plants when transplanted to give them some shade, and you can see that in this picture here. The row cover should be clipped up on hoops for maximum airflow. So in other words, you need it over the plants, but you don't want it too close to the plants because having it too close to the plants actually causes a buildup of heat close to those plants. So you want the shade, yes, but you want good air movement under the cover. And then you start removing the cover once the plants are established. That's generally after about 2 weeks. And then you start removing it for a few hours a day until the plants can then endure the full sun. So that's the first step, is to get those plants established. And then provide shade over the plants from that point on. And again, if you're growing within a structure, put a shade cloth on the top of the structure. Looking at this picture here, we have cucumbers that are grown in the same tunnel that are on the south side of the lettuce. In other words, the lettuce is within the shade of the canopy of the trellised cucumbers. So again, that can be very helpful. Jason mentioned that he uses 50% shade cloth along the ridge of the tunnel. He doesn't cover the entire tunnel, he just covers the part of the tunnel that transmits light to the lettuce during the warmer part of the day, during the late morning, during midday, and then early afternoon. So he still gets full morning and then evening sun on the crop, but during the warmer part of the day, the crop is shaded. And so he's had quite good success growing lettuce during the warm part of the growing season. Now, we've talked so far about growing crops with the goal of extending season, but you can also extend the season by growing crops, harvesting them, and then storing them in a marketable state. So frequently when farmers are thinking about growing and marketing crops during the cool times of the year, during late fall, winter, and early spring, yes, some of these crops are growing in the ground and they're harvested for sales, but other crops are grown during the warm part of the year, harvested, and then held under storage. And this could be the case with root crops such as carrots and beets, potatoes as well. And they would typically be stored in a situation that is cool and humid. We have other types of crops such as onions, garlic, and dehydrated vegetables, which are stored cool and dry. Sweet potatoes are stored under warm and humid conditions, and then winter squash, garlic, and pumpkins are stored under warm and dry conditions. And again, for more information on the specific storage conditions for specific crops, please reach out and we can discuss that further. But again, part of season extension is holding crops in storage for marketing during the cold time of the year. And from the standpoint of marketing, again, this is what's driving season extension, you know, the interest in locally grown produce, the growing interest, and also the fact that in many cases, crops that are grown under season extension are actually more valuable per unit. There are, again, as we mentioned earlier, there are buyers who are interested in 12-season production. We have farmers markets that are now operating 12 months out of the year that need a supply of locally grown crops. We have farmers who have established winter CSA situations. Again, why limit a CSA to just 9 months when there's interest in 12 months of fresh vegetables? And then we have institutional sales opportunities, particularly sales to schools and universities, which are looking for crops during the non-traditional production season. In other words, crops during the fall, winter, and early spring. And a farmer willing to reach out to this will find a ready market for institutional sales of vegetables. A couple of quick case studies on marketing. This was in 2013. This was lettuce that was planted in a plastic mulched raised bed, as you can see in this picture. It was grown as head lettuce. It was harvested and then sold to a wholesaler who then sold it to a school system. The farmer reported success with this approach. There was less return than tomatoes, and tomatoes are the benchmark by which specialty crops are measured in a tunnel, but it was certainly satisfactory from the standpoint of the farmer's goal of income per square foot. Another case study, this was in 2012. This was lettuce and greens on raised beds in multiple rows within a high tunnel. These were harvested and sold as a fresh cut salad mix and multiple harvests per bed. And the farmer made 2 to 3 plantings so they could have a consistent harvest over a 2-month period. And they realized $3 to $8 per pound for the crop here. And the return was about $1 per square foot, which again, the farmer felt was a successful situation within this season extension scenario. Now I wanted to close with some thoughts on the 2013-2014 fall, winter, and spring production season. And this was still early in the experience of many farmers in season extension. And we were using tunnels at this point. You know, again, this is 7-8 years ago. But we still were learning about the most effective use of these various structures and tools we had at our disposal to extend the season. So taking a look at this graph, this is showing temperatures in Springfield, Missouri during the winter of 2013-2014. And you can see, if you look at the minimum temperature lines, which is the light blue lines, we got really cold that year. And in fact, we had temperatures approaching minus 13 degrees. So it was quite cold. Looking at the orange and dark blue lines, these are average maximum temperature, average minimum temperature. It was cold, folks. It was cold that year. And we actually learned quite a bit from some of the successes and some of the failures under these environmental conditions. So again, the polar vortex strikes Missouri in 2013-2014. What did we learn? Well, we meaning the farming community, were quite frankly, we were unprepared for the severity of the season. And we learned from this. And in fact, those farmers who have continued in winter production, who endured that season, have definitely changed their approaches to winter production. Planning has certainly paid off. Some of the strategies the farmers have now adopted in response to enduring that winter, we've talked about already, but the double layer of poly that's inflated, double or triple layers of poly on end walls, the doors going into and out of the tunnels now are double, poly layers over the vents and end walls, and then making sure that you do a good job of sealing that contact point between the walls and the soil, and in fact using insulation as we saw in that one slide. Even using row covers within the high tunnels to give additional layers of protection, we had some problems because it was so cold that the row covers had to be left in place for several days. And this led to problems with light management. And in fact, it lowered the quality of crops, particularly leafy greens, because we weren't able to uncover those crops. We had situations where the temperature was at or below freezing for multiple days. And it's difficult to remove covers without damaging crops, but covers left in place for that long of a period of time will also cause problems because of light management issues. We also had situations where we just didn't have enough layers in place, and that caused problems. And then again, we had issues with covering and uncovering areas with single large row covers. And we found it was more effective, again, we meaning farmers found it was more effective to cover and uncover individual beds. In other words, breaking larger covers into sections. Humidity issues. We had extended periods of cold gray weather. So we had humidity problems, and it was difficult to vent because it was so cold. And as soon as the temperature warmed into the 30s or 40s, farmers were out there venting, again, to remove that humid air and to reduce the problem with humidity buildup. So again, it was a problem. And then leaving row covers in place for extended periods of time led to humidity buildup under the row covers. So again, the take-home message is here. We have to vent as soon as we can, even when it's cold out. And we need to take row covers off as soon as we can, even when it's cold out. And we saw loss of crops to cold. And we learned again that we want to put our cold-tolerant crops into outer beds. You know, obviously in a cold season, those beds along the outer edges of the tunnel are going to be the colder. The crops are going to be the colder beds. So we want to perhaps focus on root crops in those beds. Make sure that we choose cold-tolerant cultivars. Keep in mind that smaller sized plants are less vulnerable than larger plants to cold. Those vegetables that we've already harvested off to are more vulnerable to cold. So again, thinking back to the situation with spinach, if we're growing both full-size spinach for individual leaf harvest versus baby spinach for one cut harvest, those plants that we've been harvesting off of for some period of time are going to be more likely to be damaged than the smaller plants. We want to be always thinking about double layers or even more layers of row covers if necessary to protect during extremely cold periods. And then those root vegetables, we can actually put a layer of straw mulch over the top of those root vegetables to help manage them. Again, with root vegetables, we're not concerned about light because, again, we're going to be harvesting the roots. So we want to put our attention with row covers over crops like spinach and salad greens. Now, you might say, well, why didn't we just use some backup heating? Well, we actually had sort of the perfect storm. 2013, 2014 was a winter where propane prices were extremely high. And it was difficult for farmers to justify the use of supplemental heating for long periods of time because of the cost of propane that winter. All right, well, now let's conclude with some resources. I have found these 3 books by Eliot Coleman to be extremely helpful from the standpoint of season extension. And certainly the New Organic Grower was a starting point and is a starting point for many specialty crop farmers, but particularly if your interest is in season extension, the 4-Season Harvest and the Winter Harvest Handbook are 2 excellent books that you'll want to consider adding to your library. I do want to mention that we are planning a winter vegetable production conference for 2021. In normal times, this would be an in-person conference. We would have a day of classroom sessions, and then we would have a day of visiting farms. But with the current situation with COVID, The 2021 Winter Vegetable Production Conference is going to be a virtual conference, and what we've decided to do is to highlight farms in Southwest Missouri that have been successful in season extension. And we're going to do features on each of those farms, about an hour-and-a-half long video, tracking these farms through the fall. And then we'll present these videos during 4 evenings in January and February. And we're going to invite everyone to join us those evenings to learn from successful farmers who have had good luck, good success with winter vegetable production. Check the Webb City Farmers Market website for more details, and you can find this easily by Googling Webb City Farmers Market. And Webb City Farmers Market is our collaborator in the Winter Vegetable Production Conference. And we haven't set the dates yet in January, February. We will soon, and those dates will then be announced on the Webb City Farmers Market